Sometimes a person can get so used to disappointment that numbness starts to feel safer than hope. It is deeply exhausting to live that way, especially when the world keeps rewarding silence, passivity, and self-erasure. In these stories, we are walking through the quiet ache of people who nearly gave up on their own worth because life had worn them down for too long. But not every cold season lasts forever, and sometimes one steady person shows up and refuses to let that pain keep making the rules. Before this video is over, one writer will stand at a doorway with everything in them telling them to run, and that moment will change far more than they expect. Through all of it, real accountability is coming, hard truths are coming, and the peace that follows honest boundaries is coming too. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us step into the very first story together. The day my new coworker broke my entire worldview at 3:15 in the afternoon. I was halfway through ignoring an email marked urgent when Emily Carter sat down across from me without asking and said, "Do you actually care if any of this matters?" Like she'd been watching me for weeks and finally got bored of waiting. It was 3:15 in the afternoon, that dead hour where the office hum turns into white noise and everyone pretends to be productive while mentally clocking out. And I remember staring at her like she'd just spoken a language I forgot existed. I told her no, not really, because that was the honest answer, and she smiled like that was exactly what she expected. My job at Halberg Analytics was simple enough that I could do it on autopilot, spreadsheets, reports, the same loop every day, and I had turned that into a system where nothing touched me, nothing mattered, and nothing followed me home. That was the point. Emily didn't fit into that system. She had just joined the team 2 weeks earlier, and already people were adjusting around her, talking a little more, sitting up a little straighter, like she was quietly rearranging the gravity of the room. When she got assigned to work with me on a quarterly projection overhaul, I figured she'd either burn out or adapt. Instead, she leaned in harder. That first afternoon, she refused to let me keep things surface level, and I should have shut it down, but I didn't. That was mistake number one. We started working side by side, and she kept asking questions that had nothing to do with the actual work. Not small talk, not office chatter, but things like why I never pushed back in meetings, or why I never seemed frustrated when our manager, Daniel Brooks, dumped extra work on us at 4:45 in the afternoon. I told her frustration implied expectation, and I didn't expect anything from this place. She laughed, not dismissive, but like she found it fascinating. Over the next few days, she kept showing up at my desk at the same time, 3:15 in the afternoon, like it was scheduled, and every time she chipped at something I had locked down. She told me she used to think like me, that nothing had inherent meaning, that everything was just systems pretending to be important, but then her brother got sick last year, and suddenly the small things weren't small anymore. She said meaning wasn't something you found, it was something you assigned, aggressively, deliberately, even if it felt fake at first. I told her that sounded like lying to yourself. She said maybe, but it was better than opting out of your own life. That stuck more than I wanted to admit. The work itself started changing too. We stopped just completing tasks and started questioning them, rewriting parts of the process, pushing back on Daniel when his requests didn't make sense. The first time I spoke up in a meeting, I felt this weird spike of adrenaline, like I had broken a rule I didn't realize I was following. Emily just nodded at me like it was normal. That became the pattern. She would push, I would resist, and then I would give in just enough to surprise myself. It wasn't dramatic, no big turning point at first, just small recalibrations that added up. Then one night around 8 o'clock, we were the last two in the office finishing a deadline Daniel had insisted couldn't wait, and the system crashed. Completely wiped 3 hours of work. I felt nothing, just that same blank acceptance I always had, already preparing to redo it without complaint. Emily slammed her hand on the desk so hard it echoed. She said, "No, we're not doing that," and grabbed her bag. I told her it didn't matter, we'd just redo it. She turned on me, actually angry, and said, "It matters because you're here, spending your time, and you're acting like that has zero value." I remember standing there, caught between irritation and something else I couldn't name. She dragged me out of the office, literally pulled my sleeve like I was a kid, and we ended up at a small bar down the street. We sat there in silence for a while, and then she asked me what I did outside of work. I didn't have a real answer. That's when it hit me how small my life had become, not in a dramatic way, just in this quiet, controlled shrinking I had convinced myself was stability. She told me about her brother again, about hospital rooms and late-night drives, and how she started noticing everything because she didn't know how much time she had left with him. She said it rewired her, forced her to engage even when it hurt. I told her I didn't see the point if everything ends anyway. She leaned forward and said, "Exactly, that's the point. It ends so you don't get to be neutral." That line stuck in my head for days. Things escalated at work the following week when Daniel blamed us for delays that weren't our fault. Normally I would have taken it, nodded, moved on. This time I didn't. I laid out exactly where the process was failing and why his last-minute changes were the real issue. The room went quiet. Daniel looked like he was deciding whether to shut me down or actually listen. Emily didn't say anything, just watched. He backed off. It was small, but it changed something fundamental. After that, we started spending time outside of work more intentionally. Coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long walks where we talked about everything I used to avoid: purpose, fear, whether caring was worth the risk. I kept waiting for the novelty to wear off, for me to snap back into that detached baseline, but it didn't happen. Instead, I started noticing things. The way she laughed when she was tired. The way I actually looked forward to 3:15 in the afternoon. The way work stopped feeling like an endless loop and started feeling like a space where something could happen. That scared me more than anything, because it meant I had something to lose. The real breaking point came on a Friday at 5:20 in the evening when Daniel called us into his office and said there were going to be layoffs and our project team was under review. Old me would have detached immediately, accepted it as inevitable. New me didn't have that option. Emily squeezed my hand under the table, subtle but intentional, and I realized I cared, not just about the job, but about staying in the same orbit as her. That night we sat on her apartment floor, takeout containers everywhere, and planned contingencies like our lives actually depended on it. It wasn't just about survival, it was about choosing a direction. Over the next few days, we worked harder than I ever had, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to protect something that mattered. When the decision finally came in the following week at 10:30 in the morning, we were both kept on. I expected relief. What I felt instead was something heavier, a kind of responsibility I had spent years avoiding. Afterward, Emily looked at me and said, "So does it matter now?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about the version of me from a month earlier, the one who would have shrugged and said no, and I realized that guy wasn't gone, but he wasn't in control anymore either. I told her, yeah, it does, and for the first time it didn't feel like I was lying to myself. It felt like I had chosen something, and that choice was going to keep costing me attention, effort, vulnerability, all the things I used to avoid. But sitting there with her, I understood what she meant. It ends so you don't get to be neutral, and for once that didn't sound like a burden. It sounded like a reason to keep going. Emily pushed when he treated his days like a checklist, and she did it with calm, steady insistence, because she had seen what happens when people stop caring. She called out the small compromises that formed his numbness and held him accountable in the quiet moments when it was easiest to hide. Her insistence failed the cruel logic of detachment, because she taught him to name what he valued and then protect it. That lesson moves us from an office reawakening to a small town where a stranger does the same thing. And now it is time for us to read the next story together. The day a stranger walked into my dead-end town and made me feel something again. I was halfway through another dead shift at Darren's auto when she walked in asking questions nobody around here ever asks. And I remember thinking right then that she was either lost or about to ruin the quiet nothingness I had built my life around. My name is Kyle and I have lived in Briar's Edge my whole life, which sounds poetic until you realize there is no edge, just the same strip mall, the same gas station, the same 3 streets looping like a broken record. People here do not leave, and they definitely do not change. By 10 in the morning every day, I already knew how the rest of it would go. Darren would complain about parts suppliers, Marcus would swing by to talk about high school football like it still mattered, and I would count the hours until closing without ever feeling like time actually moved. That morning was no different until she pushed open the glass door and looked around like she expected the place to surprise her. Her name was Eliza. She told me that right away, like introductions still had weight. She asked me what people did for fun here, and I almost laughed in her face, because nobody had asked me that since I was a kid who still believed there was something waiting outside this place. I told her the truth, which was nothing, unless you count drinking behind the grocery store or driving in circles pretending the road might lead somewhere new. She did not react the way most outsiders do. She did not look disappointed or bored. She just nodded like I had handed her a puzzle she wanted to solve. Over the next few days, she kept showing up. At first, I thought her car needed more work than I realized, but it became obvious she was not there for that. She would lean on the counter and ask me things that felt invasive in a way I could not explain, like what I wanted out of life or why I never left. Nobody here asks questions like that because we all already know the answers, and we have agreed not to say them out loud. I told her I stayed because there was nowhere better to go, which was only half true. The real reason was that I had stopped believing anything better existed. She did not argue with me. She just said that sounded like something someone says right before they prove themselves wrong. That line stuck in my head longer than it should have. One night around 8 o'clock, she asked me to show her around town after my shift. I almost said no because routines are the only thing keeping this place from swallowing you whole. But something about her made saying no feel like locking a door I did not even know I had. So I said yes. I drove her past everything there was to see in about 20 minutes, which made her laugh in a way that did not feel mocking. We ended up parked near the old water tower, where people used to hang out back when I still believed moments like this mattered. She asked me what I thought would happen if I left Briar's Edge. I told her nothing would change, that I would just be the same person somewhere else, still stuck, still empty. She turned to me and said that might be true, but at least somewhere else would not be reinforcing it every single day. That was the first time I felt something crack inside me, like a wall I had been leaning on suddenly shifted. After that night, things escalated in a way I was not prepared for. I started noticing how much of my life was just repetition without intention. The same breakfast, the same conversations, the same empty feeling that I had convinced myself was normal. Eliza kept pushing, not aggressively, but persistently. She would show up with ideas like driving out past the county line just to see what was there or trying something new even if it felt pointless. One afternoon around 3 o'clock, she dragged me to a small trail I had passed 100 times but never walked. We spent hours just talking, and I realized I had not had a real conversation in years. Not the kind where you actually say what you think instead of what keeps things comfortable. I told her I felt like nothing I did mattered, like the entire town existed in a vacuum where time did not count. She listened without trying to fix it, which somehow made it easier to keep talking. Then she said something that hit harder than anything else. She said meaning is not something you find in a place, it is something you build with people, and if you never risk that, of course everything feels empty. That idea scared me more than anything because it meant the problem was not Briar's Edge, it was me. The shift happened a week later. Darren offered me a full-time position with a small raise, the kind of offer I used to think was the best I could hope for. Normally I would have accepted without thinking. Stability was the closest thing to purpose I had. But that morning, Eliza came in and asked me what I was going to do next with my life. Not my job, my life. I remember standing there holding the offer in my hand, feeling like I was at some kind of breaking point. Accepting it meant everything would stay the same, safe and numb. Turning it down meant stepping into something uncertain and possibly worse. For the first time, I did not default to the safe option. I told Darren I needed time to think, which shocked him more than if I had quit on the spot. That night around 9 o'clock, I met Eliza again at the water tower. I told her I was scared that if I left I would fail and end up right back here, proving that this place was all I deserved. She said failure somewhere else still meant I tried, and trying was the only way to break the cycle I kept complaining about. Then she admitted something that changed everything. She said she was only in town temporarily, staying with her cousin Sarah, and she was leaving in a few weeks. The urgency of that hit me like a punch. For the first time, the idea of losing something here felt real, not because the town mattered, but because she did. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about abstract ideas or philosophical emptiness. This was about a person who made me feel like I could be more than the version of myself I had settled into. Over the next few days, I made a decision that would have sounded insane to the version of me from a month ago. I turned down Darren's offer and started looking for work outside Briar's Edge. It was messy and uncertain and honestly terrifying. Marcus told me I was making a mistake. Darren said I was throwing away a good thing. Maybe they were right, but for the first time their opinions did not feel like absolute truths. On her last night in town, we went back to the water tower one more time. I told Eliza what I had decided, and she smiled in a way that felt both proud and sad. She said she never came here expecting to change anything. She just refused to let a place define her, and somehow that spilled over into my life. We did not make any promises about the future. There was no dramatic plan or guarantee we would end up in the same place. But when she hugged me goodbye, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. Briar's Edge had not changed. It was still the same quiet, stagnant town it had always been. The difference was that I no longer saw it as the boundary of my world. A week later, I packed my car and drove out past the county line for the first time in years. I did not know exactly where I was going, just that staying would mean undoing everything I had started to feel. As the town disappeared in my rearview mirror, I expected the usual emptiness to creep back in. Instead, there was something else, something unfamiliar but solid. It was not happiness exactly, more like the possibility of it. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough to keep going. Eliza arrived like a question that would not be shrugged off, and she made him examine the habits that had become his identity. She refused to let comfortable small-town routines define what he deserved, and she pushed him toward action instead of excuses. Her refusal to accept complacency undermined the safe inertia he had built and helped him choose uncertainty over a slow erasure. That same patient, constant pressure is what carries us into the next writer who is being refused permission to leave unchanged. So let us move on to that story together. I thought I was incapable of caring until a woman in a nowhere town refused to let me leave unchanged. I was already halfway out of the motel room when Alina knocked like she owned the door, like she knew I wouldn't answer but she'd still get in somehow. And for a second I actually considered climbing out the window just to avoid whatever conversation she was about to force on me because that was my thing, right? Leave before anything got complicated. Leave before names mattered. Leave before I had to feel anything real. But then she knocked again, louder, and said my name in that steady voice that made it sound like I wasn't as invisible as I kept pretending to be, and that pissed me off more than it should have. I opened the door just enough to look at her and said, "I'm leaving," like that explained everything, like that was the full story of me, and she just looked at the duffel bag in my hand, then back at my face and said, "You always are," and somehow that landed harder than anything else she could have said. I'd been drifting for years by that point, city to city, cheap rentals, cash jobs, no ties, no real friends, no calls to answer, nothing to anchor me, and I liked it that way because it meant nothing could break, nothing could be taken, nothing could hurt me if it was never mine to begin with, and yeah, it sounds dramatic when I say it out loud now, but at the time it just felt normal, like breathing. I ended up in that town by accident, just a wrong turn off a highway that stretched too long and too empty. And I stopped because my car started making a noise that didn't sound optional, and that's where I met Alina, at a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, where she worked like she actually gave a damn about every person who walked in, which made no sense to me at all. She sat down across from me on her break the first day like we were already in the middle of a conversation, asked me where I was from, where I was going, why I looked like I hadn't slept properly in weeks, and I gave her the same non-answers I always gave people, vague, deflective, nothing to hold on to. But she didn't let it slide. She kept pushing, not aggressively, just consistently, like she had all the time in the world and I was just another thing worth understanding. I stayed in town longer than I planned because my car needed parts. That was the excuse anyway. But the truth was I kept going back to that diner, kept sitting in her section, kept letting her talk to me like I was more than just a guy passing through, and it started to get under my skin in a way I didn't like. By the third day she knew I took my coffee black. Knew I didn't like small talk, but somehow got me talking anyway. Knew enough to say my name in a way that made it feel like it meant something. And that was the problem, because names aren't supposed to mean anything when you're built like me. When you've decided that everything is temporary and therefore nothing matters. She told me about her life like it wasn't some fragile thing she had to protect. Told me about growing up there, about wanting to leave but never quite doing it. About people she'd lost and people she still held onto. And I kept waiting for the moment where I'd feel that familiar urge to disconnect, to check out, to mentally pack my bags before my body followed, but it didn't come as quickly as it should have. Instead, I found myself staying longer after finishing my food, asking her questions I didn't actually care about on the surface, but somehow did underneath, and that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. The night everything shifted was around 9 in the evening when the diner was nearly empty, and she locked the door early, flipped the sign, and sat across from me without her apron like she'd decided something. Like this wasn't just another shift, and she said, "You don't believe any of this matters, do you?" And I laughed because it felt like a trick question. Like she'd skipped straight to the part I never let people see, and I told her, "It doesn't, simple as that, no hesitation," and she didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just leaned forward and said, "Then why are you still here?" And I didn't have an answer ready, which annoyed me more than anything else because I always had answers, even if they were empty ones. I tried to brush it off, said it was the car, said it was convenience, said it was nothing, but she shook her head like she could see through all of it and said, "You're scared to care because you think it'll prove you wrong," and that hit somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. Because yeah, maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe I'd built this whole life around not needing anything so I'd never have to deal with losing it. And here she was, in some nowhere town I never meant to stop in, poking holes in that without even trying that hard. Things escalated faster after that, not in some dramatic, explosive way, but in these small, steady moments that kept stacking up, like her grabbing my hand when I got too quiet, like me telling her things I hadn't told anyone in years without even realizing I was doing it. Like the way she'd look at me when I tried to shut down and just wait it out instead of letting me disappear. And it got to a point where leaving started to feel less like freedom and more like something I was hiding behind. That's what made that morning so tense, me standing there with my bag, her at the door, both of us knowing that if I walked out, it wouldn't just be another exit, it would be me choosing that empty version of myself again, and she said it straight. No hesitation, if you go now, don't come back, not as a threat, just as a fact, and I realized she meant it, that she wasn't going to be another temporary thing I could revisit when it was convenient, and that scared me more than anything else ever had. I told her I wasn't built for this, that I didn't do attachments, that everything ends anyway, so what's the point? And she stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat off her, and said, "The point is that it's happening now," like that was enough, like that was everything, and for some reason it was. I wish I could say I made some clean, decisive choice right there, that I dropped the bag and everything changed instantly, but it wasn't that simple. It was messy and uncomfortable and full of doubt. I stood there for what felt like forever, going back and forth in my head, weighing a life that meant nothing against a moment that suddenly meant too much. And in the end, it wasn't logic that decided it. It was the fact that walking away felt worse than staying scared. So I set the bag down, not dramatically, just enough for her to see it. And she didn't smile or celebrate. She just nodded like she understood what that cost me, and that made it real in a way nothing else had. I stayed, not just for another day or two, but long enough to realize that all that nothing I'd built my life around wasn't as solid as I thought. That maybe meaning isn't something you find in big, obvious ways. Maybe it's just someone refusing to let you be nothing. Refusing to let you disappear into your own excuses. And yeah, it's terrifying, because now there's something to lose. Now there's someone who could hurt me just by not being there one day. But for the first time, that risk feels more honest than the emptiness I was hiding in. I still don't have everything figured out. I still get the urge to run when things get too real. But now there's a voice in my head that sounds like Alina, steady and patient, asking me why I'm still here. And for once, I actually have an answer. Alina would not allow him to be a guest in his own life, and she did it without drama, only steady presence and the quiet expectation that he could do better. She saw his defense mechanisms, and gently, persistently chipped away at them until caring felt like a risk worth taking. Her strategy exposed how avoidance looks like strength, until it is confronted with real human warmth. That insight leads directly into the gym, where a woman does almost the same work by asking a single, direct question. And now we will read that next story together. I didn't care if I lived or died until a woman at my gym asked me why I was still showing up. I was midway through my fourth set of deadlifts when the bar slipped just enough to rip skin off my palm, and I didn't even react, just reset my grip and kept going like the pain belonged to someone else. That was kind of my whole thing back then. Show up, lift heavy, lave, repeat. No music I cared about, no goals I believed in, no reason behind it except that stopping felt worse than continuing. It was around 6 in the evening, same as every weekday, same grey lighting, same stale rubber smell. I had been doing this for 3 years straight, barely missing a day, and if you asked me why I would have given you some generic line about discipline, but the truth was I didn't think my life meant enough to do anything else. I wasn't trying to get stronger for a purpose. I was just trying to feel something that wasn't nothing. That's when Sarah walked over and said, "You're bleeding," like it actually mattered. I glanced at my hand, shrugged, and said, "It's fine." She didn't leave, most people did. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching me like I was a problem she intended to solve. "Why do you keep going like that?" she asked. I almost laughed because nobody had ever asked me that straight. "Because I can," I said. She shook her head. "That's not a reason." I ignored her and started my next set, but I could feel her still there, not intimidated, not impressed, just present. It got under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. Over the next few days, she kept showing up around the same time. Not stalking, not hovering, just always somewhere nearby. I started noticing her routine. She trained hard but not obsessively, talked to people, smiled like she actually existed in her own life. One night around 7:15, she sat on the bench next to mine while I was resting and said, "I'm serious. Why do you come here every day?" I was tired enough that I didn't bother deflecting. "It doesn't matter," I said. "Nothing does. This is just something to do." She looked at me for a long second, not judging, just taking it in. "That sounds exhausting," she said. I shrugged again. "It's consistent." She laughed softly. "Consistently empty is still empty." That line stuck harder than any weight I lifted. I didn't respond, but I thought about it the entire workout. And then again when I got home to my quiet apartment where I usually zoned out, sometimes scrolling, sometimes gooning just to pass time, anything to avoid sitting with my own head. The next day I almost skipped the gym just to prove I wasn't predictable, but I went anyway, because of course I did. Around 6:30, Sarah waved me over. "Spot me," she said, like we were already on that level. I hesitated, then agreed. As I stood behind her, hands ready near the bar, she said, "You ever think about stopping?" I thought she meant the set. "Not really," I said. She racked the weight and sat up, looking straight at me. "I mean all of it, the routine, the autopilot." I didn't answer right away. Finally I said, "If I stop, there's nothing underneath." She nodded like that confirmed something for her. "Or maybe you just haven't looked." That pissed me off more than it should have. Who was she to suggest there was anything worth finding? I went harder that night, added weight I knew I shouldn't, pushed until my vision blurred. On my last set, something in my lower back gave a sharp warning, not a full injury but close enough that I had to drop the bar. I stood there, breathing hard, realizing I had almost seriously hurt myself, and for what? Not for a goal, not for a competition, just to avoid thinking. Sarah was there again, handing me a towel. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, but it felt different this time. Not detached, a little shaken. "You're going to break yourself if you keep doing this without a reason," she said. I snapped back, "And what, you have won?" She didn't get defensive. "Yeah," she said. "I like my life, I want to stay in it." That hit me in a place I didn't have a defense for. We started talking more after that. Not deep at first, just small things between sets. Her job, my job, what we did outside the gym. She invited me for coffee one night after a workout around 8, and I almost said no out of habit, but something in me was curious in a way I hadn't felt in years. Sitting across from her, I realized how long it had been since I actually paid attention to another person. She asked questions and waited for real answers. When I gave vague ones, she pushed a little, not aggressively, just enough to make it hard to hide. Over the next few weeks, my routine didn't change on the surface. I still showed up every day, still lifted, still followed the same structure, but it started to feel different. When I hit a set, I thought about what she said about staying in your own life. When I rested, I found myself looking for her, not out of obsession, but because being around her made the place feel less like a void. One evening around 7, she asked me, "What would happen if you skipped a day?" I said, "I don't skip days." She smiled slightly. "That's not what I asked." I thought about it and realized I genuinely didn't know. The idea made me uneasy, like I would disappear if I broke the pattern. "Then maybe that's your answer," she said. "You're not doing this because you want to. You're doing it because you're afraid not to." That night I went home and didn't distract myself. No scrolling, no gooning, nothing. I just sat there, and it was uncomfortable as hell. But underneath that discomfort, there was something else. Not meaning, not yet, but space. The next day, for the first time in years, I didn't go to the gym. Instead, I met Sarah for a walk around 6 in the evening. It felt wrong at first, like I was skipping something important, but as we talked, I realized I wasn't losing anything real. I was just stepping out of a loop. When I went back to the gym the day after, everything felt sharper. The weights felt heavier in a good way, like they actually mattered because I chose to be there. Sarah caught my eye from across the room and smiled, and I felt something I hadn't associated with that place before. Not numbness, not obligation. Something closer to being alive. Weeks turned into months, and the routine kept evolving. We trained together sometimes, pushed each other, but also left space for other parts of life. I started setting actual goals, not just arbitrary numbers. I paid attention to how I felt, not just how much I could lift. One night around 8:30, after a long session, I told her, I used to think none of this mattered. She asked, "And now?" I looked around the gym, then back at her. "Now I think it matters because I do." She nodded like that was enough. And it was. I didn't suddenly become some perfect, motivated person. I still had days where everything felt pointless. But now there was a counterweight to that feeling. A reason to keep going that wasn't just habit or fear. It was connection. It was choice. It was the realization that even if the universe didn't care whether I existed, I could still decide that I did. And somehow, that made every rep count in a way it never had before. Sarah used firmness and curiosity, rather than pity, when she asked why he kept showing up to a routine that masked a deeper absence. She refused to accept performance as meaning, and she taught him to test what he actually wanted instead of defaulting to autopilot. The failure of his old patterns became clearer because she modeled living with intention rather than just repeating action. That experience prepares us for the student who is pushed awake in the dead of night, so let us go on to that next story together. I was numb through my degree until she sat across from me at 3 in the morning. I was halfway through my third cup of burnt library coffee at 3 in the morning when Maya Patel finally asked me why I bothered showing up at all. I did not look up from the problems set in front of me, just kept writing like my hand was on autopilot, like it had been for the last 2 years of my life, grinding through assignments I did not care about for a degree I did not believe in. She dragged a chair across from me anyway, the sound loud enough to get a few irritated looks from other students, and just sat there waiting like she had all the time in the world. "Ethan," she said not quietly, "I am serious. You look like a ghost that learned how to hold a pen. Why are you even here?" I shrugged and finished the line I was writing before answering. "Because I enrolled," I said, "and because finishing is easier than explaining why I quit." That was the first time she laughed at me, not in a mean way, just like I had said something absurd that she could not let pass. "That is the worst reason I have ever heard," she said, leaning forward, eyes locked on mine like she was trying to pull something out of me I did not know was there. "You are paying for this. You are losing sleep for this. You spend your nights here instead of doing literally anything else. And your reason is just inertia." I finally looked up then, really looked at her messy bun, tired eyes, ink smudged on her wrist, alive in a way that felt almost aggressive. "Yeah," I said. Inertia works. She did not accept that, not then, not ever. That night turned into a pattern, then a routine, then something I could not ignore. Every few nights we ended up at the same table at the same time, somewhere between midnight and sunrise, and she would chip away at me with questions I did not want to answer. At first I treated it like background noise, like the hum of the fluorescent lights or the distant cough of someone who had been up too long, but Maya was persistent in a way that made ignoring her impossible. She wanted reasons not just for why I was there, but for everything. Why I chose my major, why I never talked about the future, why I never seemed stressed even when deadlines stacked up like a wall. The truth was simple and ugly. I did not believe any of it mattered. Not the grades, not the degree, not the career waiting on the other side. It all felt like a long, expensive distraction from the fact that nothing stuck, nothing lasted, nothing meant anything once you zoomed out far enough. I told her a watered-down version of that at around 1:30 in the morning about 2 weeks after we met, expecting her to either argue or back off. She did neither. She just listened, really listened, then nodded slowly like she was cataloguing my words for later. "Okay," she said, "so if nothing matters, why does it bother you that it does not matter?" That question irritated me more than anything she had said so far. "It does not bother me," I said, "I just recognize it." She smiled like she had caught me lying. "People who are not bothered do not spend their nights grinding themselves into dust over something they think is meaningless," she said. "That is not indifference, Ethan, that is avoidance." I wanted to shut that conversation down, to retreat back into the safe, numb routine I had built, but something about the way she said my name, like it was worth saying, kept me there. So I argued, for hours, about meaning, about purpose, about how everything eventually fades. She pushed back on all of it, not with cliches or optimism, but with this stubborn insistence that maybe meaning was something you made in smaller, messier ways, not some grand universal truth you either found or did not. That was the first shift, even if I did not admit it at the time. I started noticing things again, not big things, just small details that had slipped past me before. The way the campus looked at sunrise when we finally packed up and walked out together, the air cooler quieter, like the world had not fully booted up yet. The way Maya would tap her pen against her notebook when she was thinking, then stop abruptly when she realized she was doing it. The way she would get genuinely excited about understanding a concept that had confused her an hour earlier. Those things should have been insignificant. For me, they were not. They were cracks in the wall I had built around myself. The midpoint, the real turning point, came during finals week, predictably enough. It was around 2 in the morning. The library was more crowded than usual, tension thick in the air, and Maya was not at our usual table. I told myself it did not matter, that she had her own life, her own schedule, but I kept checking the entrance anyway. After about an hour, I gave up pretending I did not care and went looking for her. I found her in one of the smaller study rooms, alone, staring at her laptop like it had personally offended her. Her notes were scattered everywhere, and for the first time since I met her, she looked overwhelmed. Not the energetic, curious, overwhelmed I was used to, but the kind that freezes you in place. "Maya," I said, stepping inside. She looked up, surprised, then tried to smile and failed. "Hey," she said, "I am fine." She was not, it was obvious. I could have left it there, made a joke, gone back to my own work, stayed in my detached lane. That is what I would have done a month earlier. Instead, I closed the door behind me and sat down across from her. "Show me what you are stuck on," I said. She hesitated, like she was not used to being the one asking for help, then turned her laptop toward me. We worked through it together, slowly at first, then with more momentum as things started to click. At some point, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled like she had been holding her breath for hours. "I hate that this matters so much to me," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I said, "that is the part that makes it matter." The second the words left my mouth, I realized they were not just for her, they were for me too. That was the moment I crossed a line I did not know I was approaching. I was no longer just reacting to her questions. I was choosing to engage, to care, to invest in something that could actually affect me. Our dynamic shifted after that. The late-night sessions were still there, but they felt different, less like an interrogation and more like a collaboration. We started talking about things outside of class, music, family, random memories that had no academic value whatsoever. One night, somewhere around 4 a.m, we ended up walking across campus with no real destination, just not ready to go home yet. She bumped her shoulder into mine lightly and said, "You know, you smile more now." I almost denied it out of reflex, then stopped. "Maybe," I said. She looked at me, not with curiosity this time, but with something softer, something that made my chest feel tight in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. "I like it," she said. I did not have a clever response for that. I just nodded and kept walking, but something had shifted again, quieter this time, deeper. The first time we kissed was not dramatic. No grand build-up, no perfect timing. It was messy and a little awkward. Outside the library just before sunrise, both of us exhausted and running on too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But it felt real in a way nothing else had for a long time. It felt like proof that maybe meaning was not something you found at the end of a long academic tunnel, but something that showed up unexpectedly when you let someone get close enough to disrupt your carefully constructed indifference. I did not suddenly become a different person. I still questioned everything. I still had days where the old numbness crept back in, but it did not have the same grip on me anymore. Because now, when I sat at that table at 3 a.m, it was not just about finishing what I started. It was about the conversations, the shared frustration, the small victories, the way Maya would look at me like I was actually there. And for the first time in a long time, I was. Maya refused to let Ethan hide behind exhaustion, and she kept asking the kind of questions that exposed the sadness underneath his routine. She showed him that avoidance can look disciplined from the outside, while still hollowing a person out on the inside. Her quiet patience turned a lifeless grind into something shared and human, and that carries us naturally into another sleepless night, where one unexpected meeting begins to break a man out of his own fog. Let us read that next story together. I thought nothing mattered until I met her at 2 a.m. I was halfway through crossing Greyston Drive at around 2 a.m. when I realized I had no memory of deciding to leave my apartment. Just that same numb autopilot pulling me through another identical night, like every other one before it. And I almost didn't notice her sitting on the curb, until she said my name out loud like she'd been expecting me. My name is Daniel, and hearing it in a stranger's voice at that hour snapped something in me. Not fear exactly, just confusion sharp enough to break the fog I'd been living in for months, maybe years if I'm being honest. And I stopped right there in the middle of the road while a distant car honked like I was the problem instead of whatever weird coincidence had just hijacked my routine. Her name was Leela. She told me that before I even asked, like we were skipping steps in a conversation that had already started somewhere else. And she looked completely normal, which somehow made it worse. Hoodie pulled tight, hair tied back, eyes steady in a way that made me feel like she could see every empty thought looping through my head. I asked her how she knew my name, and she just shrugged and said she didn't, not really, just had a feeling, which should have been my cue to walk away. But instead I stepped onto the sidewalk and sat down next to her like I'd been told to without realizing it. Like my body finally had a reason to pause after weeks of drifting between work, takeout, and sleep that never actually felt like rest. I told her I didn't believe in feelings like that, didn't believe in much of anything anymore, and she laughed, not in a mocking way, more like I just said something obvious and kind of boring, and that annoyed me enough to keep talking, which was new because I hadn't wanted to talk to anyone in a long time. I explained how everything felt pointless, how every day repeated itself until time stopped meaning anything, How even the stuff people said was supposed to matter, like relationships or goals, or whatever, just felt like distractions we all agreed to pretend were important. And she listened without interrupting, just nodding slowly like she was cataloguing every word. At some point I realized I hadn't checked my phone or thought about going home once since I sat down, which was the first break in my pattern I could actually feel, like a crack forming in something solid and suffocating. She asked me what I did every night, and I told her the truth, that I walked until my legs got tired and then looped back home, sometimes passing the same corners 3 or 4 times without noticing, sometimes stopping to watch people I didn't know living lives that seemed just as empty from the outside. And she said that sounded like dying in slow motion, which hit harder than anything I'd told myself because it came from someone else, and it sounded undeniable when she said it. I asked her why she was out there, and she said she couldn't sleep either, but for different reasons, that she was afraid of becoming invisible, not physically, but in the way people stop being seen even when they're right in front of you. And I didn't understand that at first until she looked straight at me and said I already was invisible, that I moved through the city like a ghost who didn't expect to be acknowledged. And the worst part was I couldn't argue with her because it was exactly how I felt. We sat there for what felt like hours but could have been minutes, time finally behaving unpredictably instead of dragging in a straight line. And eventually she stood up and said we should walk, not in my usual aimless loop but somewhere specific, which again should have made me push back, but instead I followed her like there was finally a direction attached to my movement. She took me through streets I'd technically seen before but never actually noticed, pointing out small details like a broken sign that flickered in a rhythm or a stray cat that apparently followed the same route every night. And I realized how much of the world I'd been ignoring because I'd already decided it meant nothing. At around 3 in the morning, we ended up at a small diner that was somehow still open, and she insisted we go in, which broke another rule I didn't know I'd set for myself about avoiding places where I might have to interact with people. And I almost belayed right there, but she grabbed my wrist, not forcefully but enough to anchor me, and said if everything was meaningless then there was no reason not to try something different, which twisted my own logic against me in a way I couldn't escape. Inside, under harsh lights and the low hum of an old fridge, we sat across from each other, and for the first time in a long time I felt present, like I wasn't watching my life from a distance but actually inside it, and it was uncomfortable in a way that made me want to run, but also weirdly grounded. We talked about nothing and everything at the same time, about stupid things like favorite foods and heavier stuff, like why people keep going even when they don't see a point, and she didn't try to fix me or argue me out of my beliefs. She just kept asking questions that made it harder to stay detached. At one point she caught me staring at her and asked what I was thinking, and I told her the truth again, that I didn't understand why talking to her felt different, why the usual emptiness wasn't filling the gaps between words, and she said maybe it wasn't that everything suddenly had meaning, maybe it was just that I was finally paying attention to something real. That idea stuck in my head longer than anything else, and when we left the diner at around 4 in the morning I noticed I didn't want the night to end, which was new because usually I was just waiting for time to pass so I could go back to sleep and reset the cycle. We kept walking until the sky started to lighten and the city shifted from quiet to restless, and eventually we ended up back near where we'd started, which felt intentional in a way my usual loops never did. She told me she didn't believe in permanent fixes, that whatever this was didn't magically solve anything, but it proved something important, that my certainty about nothing mattering wasn't as solid as I thought, because if it were, this night wouldn't feel different at all. Before she left she asked if I'd be there again the next night at the same time, and I almost said no out of habit, out of that reflex to keep everything predictable and empty, but instead I heard myself say yes, and I meant it. She smiled like she'd expected that outcome all along, and then she was gone, just another person disappearing into the city, except this time it didn't feel like she'd vanished into nothing. It felt like she'd left something behind in me that I couldn't ignore. I went home as the sun came up, and for the first time in I don't know how long I didn't immediately collapse into bed. I just sat there thinking about how close I'd come to missing her completely, to crossing that street like every other night and continuing my slow drift without interruption. The next night I went back at 2 in the morning, not out of habit but out of intention. And when she showed up again, it confirmed that this wasn't a one-time glitch. It was something I was choosing to step into. Weeks passed like that, our late-night meetings turning into a pattern that actually meant something, not in some grand cosmic way, but in a grounded human way that made my days feel less like filler between nothing events. I still don't have all the answers. I still catch myself slipping into that old mindset sometimes. But now there's a counterweight, a memory of that first night, and every night after that proves I was wrong about at least one thing. Existence didn't suddenly gain universal meaning, but it stopped being empty the moment I let someone else into it. And that difference is enough to keep me walking, not in circles anymore, but towards something I didn't think was possible before I heard my name spoken by a stranger at 2 a.m. Leela did not lecture Daniel about his emptiness. She simply stayed present long enough for him to notice that his certainty was already cracking. Her strength was in how calmly she turned his own logic around and made him see that paying attention is often the first step back into life. That lesson moves us from lonely streets at 2 a.m. to another writer who has hidden inside screens and distance for far too long. So let us continue into the next story together. I thought real life was just background noise until I met Daniel from a dead forum. I was halfway through a gooning session at around 3 a.m. when Daniel messaged me back after 8 months of silence on a forum I was sure had already died. And for some reason, that was the moment everything started to feel off. The site itself barely functioned anymore, pages loading like they were dragging themselves through mud, threads full of usernames that hadn't posted since last winter, but Daniel's reply came through instantly like he'd been waiting there the whole time. He didn't respond to the topic we had been arguing about, some dumb philosophical debate about whether anything in real life actually mattered compared to digital spaces. Instead, he just said my name and asked if I ever left my apartment. That alone should have made me close the tab, but I didn't, because I had built most of my life around the idea that nothing outside my screen really counted anyway. I told him the truth, that I worked remote, ordered everything in, barely spoke to anyone face to face unless absolutely necessary, and he replied with something that annoyed me more than it should have, saying I sounded like someone who had already checked out without realizing it. We went back and forth like that for a while, him pushing, me deflecting, until he suggested we meet up, and I actually laughed out loud sitting there in the dark because it felt so absurd, like a character in a game asking to step outside the map. But he kept insisting, not aggressively, just calmly, like it was the most normal thing in the world, and eventually I agreed just to prove a point to myself that it would be meaningless. We set a time, around 6 p.m. 2 days later, at a small coffee place I had passed 100 times without ever going inside. When I showed up, I almost didn't recognize him because I had imagined someone completely different. But Daniel was just a normal guy, average height, dark hair, wearing a worn jacket. Nothing remarkable except the way he looked directly at me like I was actually there in front of him, and not just some username floating on a screen. That eye contact alone made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain, like he was breaking some unspoken rule I had gotten used to. We sat down, and at first it was awkward, the kind of silence that feels heavier than it should, but then he started talking about the forum, about how it used to be full of people searching for something real even if they didn't admit it, and I found myself actually listening instead of just waiting to respond. At some point I realized I had left my phone face down on the table and hadn't checked it once, which genuinely unsettled me more than anything he had said. He asked me why I believed real life lacked substance, and I gave him my usual answer about how everything meaningful could be simulated, conversations, relationships, even identity, but saying it out loud felt weaker than typing it ever had. He didn't argue with me directly, he just told me about his own routine, how he worked long hours, how he still made time to meet people, how he thought meaning came from friction, from things not being perfectly controlled or optimized. I remember thinking that sounded inefficient, almost stupid, but there was something about the way he said it that made it hard to dismiss. We ended up talking until the place closed around 9 p.m, and when we stepped outside, there was this moment where neither of us moved right away, like the conversation had followed us out and was still hanging in the air. After that, we started meeting regularly, not every day, but enough that it started to disrupt my usual pattern. I still spent hours online, still drifted through forums and endless content, still defaulted to the comfort of digital noise, but there was now this other layer, these real conversations that didn't pause when I looked away, that didn't disappear when I closed a tab. It started small, just coffee, then longer walks, then actually going places I would have never bothered with before, and each time I felt this weird tension, like part of me was being pulled out of something safe into something unpredictable. The turning point came one night around 11 when we were sitting on a bench outside his apartment building, and he asked me if I ever felt anything strongly anymore, not online, but physically in the moment. I tried to brush it off, but he didn't let it go. and eventually I admitted that most things felt muted, like I was always slightly detached, observing instead of participating. He nodded like he already knew and then did something that completely caught me off guard. He reached out and grabbed my arm, not aggressively, just firmly enough that I couldn't ignore it, and said that was real, that I couldn't scroll past it or mute it or minimize it. It sounds stupid now, but that simple contact hit harder than anything I had experienced in months, maybe years, and for a second I genuinely didn't know how to react. After that, things escalated in a way I wasn't prepared for, not dramatically, but steadily, like a pressure building that I couldn't release by logging off. I started noticing how quiet my apartment actually was, how artificial the constant stream of content felt compared to a single conversation that didn't follow a script. I found myself thinking about what Daniel had said even when I was back online, and it started to ruin the illusion I had been comfortable with. The real breaking point came when the forum finally went offline for good. No warning, just gone, and instead of feeling nothing like I expected, I felt this sharp, unexpected loss, like a piece of my identity had been erased. I messaged Daniel immediately, but he didn't reply right away, and for the first time in a long time, I couldn't distract myself with anything that felt equivalent. Hours passed, then a full day, and I started to spiral in a way I hadn't experienced before, realizing how much I had relied on that constant digital presence to avoid actually confronting anything real. When he finally showed up at my door around 7 in the evening the next day, unannounced, I didn't even think. I just let him in, and the relief I felt was so immediate and overwhelming that it scared me. He told me he had been busy, nothing dramatic, just life, and that was the moment it clicked for me that real life didn't pause or buffer or wait for you to be ready. It just kept moving, and if you weren't there for it, you missed it. We talked for hours that night, longer than we ever had before, and for the first time I wasn't trying to win an argument or prove a point. I was just there, fully present in a way that felt almost foreign. I realized then that my whole belief about real life lacking substance had been built on avoiding it, on choosing environments where I could control everything and never be forced to actually feel anything unpredictable. Daniel didn't fix me or anything like that, and I'm not suddenly a completely different person, but something definitely shifted that night, something I can't really undo even if I wanted to. I still go online, still spend more time there than I probably should, but it doesn't feel the same anymore, like I've seen behind the curtain and can't fully pretend it's enough. The last time we met, around 8 in the evening a few days ago, he joked that I seemed more awake, and I didn't argue with him, because for once I actually knew what he meant. Daniel challenged that writer without showmanship and without cruelty, and that mattered because false comfort had already done enough damage. He proved that real life feels heavier not because it is easier, but because it asks something honest from us. His steady presence broke the illusion that distance is the same thing as peace. That truth leads us straight into a darker story, where being deeply understood becomes dangerous in ways no one expected, and now it is time for us to read the next story together. The girl who understood my art almost got me killed. I was halfway through deleting a piece I'd spent 3 nights on when Maya said it was the most honest thing she'd ever seen, and that's the moment everything started to unravel. I met her at this small gallery off Commissioner Street around 7 in the evening, one of those places that smells like dust and cheap wine, where people pretend to care about brush strokes and negative space. I didn't even want to be there, but my friend Daniel had begged me to show something, anything, because he thought I was wasting whatever talent I had left. The truth was I didn't feel anything when I made art anymore. It was just shapes, colors, repetition, mechanical. I could have been assembling furniture and it would have meant the same. I remember standing near my piece, this abstract mess of layered greys and warped human outlines, thinking about going home and maybe gooning just to feel something, anything, when Maya walked up and tilted her head like she was solving a puzzle only she could see. She didn't introduce herself right away. She just stared at it for a long time, then said, "You painted someone trying to disappear but failing because part of them still wants to be seen." I laughed, actually laughed, because it sounded like the kind of overinterpretation people do to feel smart, but she didn't smile back. She looked at me like she knew I was lying to myself. That should have been my first warning sign. We started talking, and she kept doing that thing where she'd describe parts of my work like they were confessions I didn't remember making. She said the distortion in the figures looked like guilt. She said the empty space wasn't emptiness, it was restraint. I told her she was reading too much into it, that I didn't feel anything when I made it, that it didn't mean anything. She shrugged and said, "It doesn't have to mean anything to you for it to be true." That line stuck with me harder than it should have. We started seeing each other after that, not in some dramatic way, just coffee around 9 in the morning, late walks near midnight, conversations that somehow always circled back to my work. She never talked about herself much, which I didn't question at the time because I was too busy being confused about why her attention felt different. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition, like she saw something I couldn't. The shift happened about 2 weeks in. I was working on a new piece in my apartment around 10 at night, same detached process, just moving my hands, when I caught myself thinking about what Maya would say about it. Not what it meant, but what she would see. That thought slowed me down. I started making choices instead of just reacting. I adjusted lines, changed colors, not because I felt inspired, but because I wanted to communicate something, even if I didn't know what yet. That scared me more than the emptiness ever had. When I showed it to her the next day, she didn't speak for a full minute. Then she said, "This one is angrier." I told her I didn't feel angry. She nodded and said, "No, but you're closer." That was the first time I realized I wasn't as numb as I thought. Things escalated fast after that. My work started getting attention, real attention, not just polite gallery nods. Daniel was ecstatic, kept saying this was the version of me he'd been waiting for. But Maya got quieter. She still came over, still watched me paint, but there was something tense about her, like she was waiting for something to go wrong. One night around 11:30, I finally asked her what was bothering her. She hesitated, then told me she'd seen one of my earlier pieces before we met, online, months ago. She said it wasn't just similar to what I was doing now, it was almost identical to something she dreamed about repeatedly. Same warped figures, same composition, even the same color palette. I told her that was a coincidence, it had to be. But she shook her head and said, "It's not just that, you're getting closer to the last one." I asked what she meant, and she described an image I hadn't painted yet but immediately saw in my head. A central figure distorted beyond recognition, surrounded by fractured versions of itself, like it was being pulled apart from multiple directions. My stomach dropped because that was exactly what I'd been sketching earlier that day. I hadn't shown anyone, not even Daniel. I asked her how she knew, and she just said, "Because every time you finish one, it gets closer." That's when the fear kicked in, real fear, the kind that makes your chest feel tight. I started noticing things after that, small things at first, files on my computer shifting slightly, like someone had opened them. Sketches I didn't remember finishing suddenly complete. I blamed stress, lack of sleep, anything that made sense. But then one night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up on my couch with paint on my hands and a finished canvas in front of me. It was the image Maya had described. Exactly, I don't sleepwalk, I never have, I called her immediately. She picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. I told her what happened and there was this long silence before she said, "You need to stop." I asked her what she meant and she said, "That last piece isn't just art, it's a threshold." I almost hung up. It sounded insane, but then she said something that froze me. "If you finish refining it, you won't be the one interpreting anymore." I didn't understand, but I knew enough to be scared. I told her to come over. When she arrived around 3 in the morning, she looked different. Not physically, but there was this intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She walked straight to the canvas and stared at it, then turned to me and said, "You're not empty, you're open." I didn't have time to process that because that's when the knocking started. Loud, aggressive. Not normal, we both froze. I asked who it was, but there was no answer, just more knocking, harder this time. Maya grabbed my arm and whispered, "They've noticed." I wanted to ask who, but the door handle started rattling. Not like someone trying to open it normally, more like they were testing it over and over. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed the canvas and dragged it toward the kitchen. Maya followed, telling me to destroy it. I hesitated for half a second because for the first time in years, the piece felt important. Not meaningless, not empty, important. That hesitation almost got me killed because the front door slammed open right after. I didn't see who came in. I just heard footsteps, fast, deliberate. Maya didn't wait. She grabbed a knife from the counter and slashed straight through the canvas. The sound was wrong, not like tearing fabric. Deeper, heavier. The moment it split, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped, completely. We stood there not breathing until I finally looked back toward the hallway. There was no one there. The door was still open, but the apartment was empty. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes before Maya finally let go of the knife. I asked her what the hell just happened, and she said, "You were getting too clear. Whatever listens through you doesn't like being seen back." I should have been skeptical. I should have walked away from all of it. But instead, I looked at the ruined canvas, then at my hands, and realized something had changed. For the first time, I cared. Not about success or validation, but about what I was creating. About what it meant. About what it could do. Maya saw it in my face and nodded slowly. "That's why I stayed," she said. "Not to stop you, just to make sure you don't disappear completely when it finally means something. I haven't stopped painting since. I just don't do it alone anymore, and I never finished the last piece." Maya saw through the art before the writer was ready to see through himself, and that kind of recognition can be both healing and frightening. What began as insight slowly revealed how exposed he really was, and that is why the danger in that story feels so personal and so sharp. Still, even in fear, the deeper lesson remains the same. People change when someone refuses to look away from what is real. That brings us into another long night, another tired soul, and another quiet connection that starts changing everything. So let us move into the next story together. Night shift nihilism until she started showing up every night. I was halfway through another dead stretch around 3 in the morning when Emily didn't leave. That was the first thing that broke the pattern, and at that hour patterns are the only thing that make the night tolerable. I worked the overnight desk at a small roadside motel just off the highway outside Johannesburg, the kind of place where the vending machine hummed louder than the traffic, and the fluorescent lights made everything look like it had already given up. Most nights felt like they existed outside of time, like I was just waiting out something that never actually arrived. I used to think that was the point of everything, not just the job but life in general, just endurance dressed up as purpose. People checked in, people checked out, and I stayed planted behind the counter like some forgotten fixture. Then Emily started showing up every night at about 2:45, ordering the same cheap coffee from the machine, and sitting in the plastic chair across from me like she had nowhere else to be. At first I barely looked at her. She had that tired, distant look I recognized in myself, like she was operating on autopilot and didn't want to acknowledge it. We didn't talk for the first week, just shared the same quiet space. Then one night she asked me what time my shift ended, and I told her 6 in the morning, and she just nodded like that meant something important. After that, she started asking small questions. What did I do before this job? Did I ever get used to the hours? Did I sleep during the day or just exist in fragments? I gave short answers at first because I didn't see the point in expanding on anything, but she kept coming back, night after night, same time, same coffee, same chair. And eventually the silence between us started to feel heavier than conversation, so I started talking more just to ease it. I told her I used to study engineering, but dropped out because it all felt pointless, like building things just meant they would eventually fall apart anyway. She didn't argue, didn't try to fix that, just listened in a way that made it hard to brush off my own words. One night around 4:15, when the sky was still completely black and the air felt like it had weight to it, she told me she worked at a hospital a few kilometers away. Night shift 2, different kind of exhaustion. She said she came here after because going straight home made everything feel too quiet, like the silence would swallow her whole. That stuck with me more than I expected. I had always thought the silence was the safest part of my life, the only place where nothing demanded anything from me. But hearing her say it like that made me wonder if I had just been hiding in it. The more we talked, the more those nights started to shift. Time stopped dragging the same way. I found myself checking the clock, not to see how much longer I had to endure, but to see how close it was to when she would walk through the door. It made no sense to me, and that bothered me at first. I had built this whole internal logic around nothing mattering, around everything being temporary, and therefore not worth investing in. But Emily kept showing up consistently, predictably, like she was quietly challenging that idea without ever saying it out loud. Around 3:30 one morning, a guy came in drunk and angry, yelling about a reservation that didn't exist. I had dealt with people like him before, but that night something felt off. He kept leaning over the counter, getting too close, his voice sharp enough to cut through the dull hum of the place. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the kind of pointless situation that proves everything I already believe. Then Emily stood up from her chair and walked over, not aggressive, just steady, and told him to back off. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had weight, like she actually expected to be listened to. The guy hesitated, looked between us, and then muttered something under his breath before stumbling back outside. The door slammed, and the silence that followed felt completely different from the one I was used to. My hands were shaking, which annoyed me more than anything. She looked at me and asked if I was okay, and for some reason I couldn't just brush it off. I told her yeah, but it came out weaker than I wanted. She didn't call me out on it, just went back to her chair like nothing dramatic had happened, but something had shifted. That was the first time I realized I didn't want to just endure these nights anymore. I wanted them to be something else, something that didn't feel like waiting for nothing. After that, I started opening up more, not in some big dramatic way, just small things. I told her about how I used to think relationships were just temporary distractions, how I avoided getting close to people because it felt easier to assume it would all end anyway. She listened like she always did, but this time she pushed back a little. She said maybe things ending didn't make them meaningless, maybe it made them more real because they didn't last forever. That idea got under my skin in a way I couldn't ignore. It didn't fix everything, didn't suddenly give me purpose, but it cracked something open. Nights started to feel different in subtle ways. The hum of the lights wasn't as oppressive. The empty lobby didn't feel like a void I was trapped in. It started to feel like a space where something could actually happen, even if it was just a conversation that mattered more than I wanted to admit. One morning, just before 6, when the first hint of light was starting to creep in, she didn't get up to leave right away. She just sat there, looking at me like she was waiting for something. I asked what was up, and she said she was tired of pretending this was just a random routine. My chest tightened in a way I wasn't used to. She said she liked being there with me, that it made the nights feel less heavy, and she wanted to know if I felt the same or if this was just another meaningless stretch of time to me. For a second, I almost defaulted to my usual answer, the safe one where nothing matters and nothing sticks. But standing there, looking at her in that ugly fluorescent light, I realized that answer didn't fit anymore, not completely. I told her I didn't know what any of this meant in the long run, but I knew those hours with her were the only part of my day that didn't feel like I was just passing time. She smiled, not like she had won something, just like she understood. After that, things didn't magically become perfect. I still had nights where the old thoughts crept back in, where everything felt pointless again. But now there was something pushing against that, something real and consistent that I couldn't dismiss as easily. We started meeting outside of the motel, grabbing breakfast after our shifts, walking through streets that were just waking up while we were winding down. It felt strange at first, like I was stepping into a life I had already decided wasn't worth engaging with. But the more time I spent with her, the harder it became to hold on to that belief without questioning it. The biggest shift came on a night when she didn't show up at 2:45. I told myself it didn't matter, that people had lives and schedules and nothing was guaranteed. But as the minutes dragged past 3, then 3:30, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just boredom or irritation, but actual concern. When she finally walked in around 4:10, looking exhausted and a little shaken, I felt this sharp, immediate relief that caught me off guard. She told me it had been a rough night at the hospital, nothing she wanted to get into, but she didn't want to go home alone with it. So she came there like she always did. And in that moment, it hit me that this wasn't just about passing time anymore. She wasn't just breaking up the monotony of my nights, she was part of them in a way that actually mattered. That realization didn't solve the bigger questions about existence or meaning, but it made them feel less urgent, less suffocating. I still work the same shift, still sit behind the same counter under the same harsh lights. But now, when the clock edges toward 2:45, I don't see it as another marker in an endless stretch of nothing. I see it as the moment something real might walk through the door, and for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. Emily did not rescue him with grand promises. She simply kept showing up until his empty night shift no longer felt like proof that life was hollow. Her steady presence defeated that old numbness because it gave him something real to anticipate, protect, and value. That matters as we step into the final story, where another writer has tied his worth to one painful failure and needs someone just as grounded to refuse that lie. Let us read this last story together. I thought failing once erased my worth until she refused to agree. I was sitting on my kitchen floor at around 11 at night staring at a rejection email I had already memorized word for word. The kind that politely thanks you for your effort, while quietly confirming you are not enough. And I remember thinking that this was it, that whatever version of me I had been building toward had just collapsed into something permanently smaller and uglier. My name is Daniel, and up until 3 months before that night I had been certain I was on track to become something real, something respectable, the kind of man people pointed to when they needed an example of discipline paying off. But then I failed the one exam that mattered, the one that would have launched my career, and it did not just feel like a setback, it felt like a verdict. Everyone around me tried to soften it. My friend Marcus said I could retake it. My sister Elena told me it did not define me, but every time they spoke I heard pity layered underneath their words, and pity is a kind of slow poison when you already suspect the worst about yourself. I stopped answering calls, stopped going to the gym, stopped doing anything that resembled forward movement, and instead I let my days blur together in a loop of sleeping late, scrolling mindlessly, and occasionally getting high on Tsar just to dull the constant pressure in my chest that told me I had wasted my one shot. By the time that night came around, I had reduced my life to the bare minimum, like I was waiting for something to officially end, even though nothing dramatic was happening, just this quiet erosion of meaning that made everything feel pointless. The only reason I even left my apartment the next morning was because I ran out of food, and I remember standing in the grocery store at around 9 in the morning staring at a shelf of cereal for way too long, because choosing between brands felt like a decision I no longer deserved to make. That is where I first noticed her, not in some cinematic way, just a normal moment where she reached past me to grab a box and said, "Excuse me," and I moved without really looking until she said my name like she already knew it. I turned and saw her properly then. Her name was Leela, and she had this calm, steady expression like she was not in a rush to be anywhere else, which felt strange in a place where everyone else moved like time was chasing them. She told me we had met once at a mutual friend's gathering months back, something I barely remembered, and then she asked how I had been, not in that casual throwaway way, but like she actually intended to listen. I almost lied out of habit, but something about the way she was looking at me made it harder than usual, so I shrugged and said not great, and she nodded like that made perfect sense instead of making things awkward. We ended up talking in that aisle for what must have been 20 minutes, and I kept expecting her to disengage, to find an excuse to leave, but she did not. She just stayed present in a way I had not experienced in a long time. Before we parted, she asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, and my first instinct was to say no, because I felt like a fraud pretending to be a functioning person. But I heard myself say yes anyway, almost like some leftover part of me refused to completely give up. When we met at a small cafe at around 10 in the morning 2 days later, I was convinced it would be a one-time thing, that she would quickly realize I was not worth the effort. But instead she asked me direct questions about what happened with the exam, about how I had been dealing with it, and every time I answered she listened without interrupting or trying to fix me. At one point I said something like I think I might just be done, like maybe this is as far as I go, and she leaned back slightly and said I do not buy that, not in a confrontational way, but in a matter-of-fact tone that caught me off guard. I asked her what she meant, and she said you were talking about yourself like a failed project instead of a person who had one bad outcome, and those are not the same thing. I remember feeling a flicker of irritation because it sounded too simple, like she was minimizing how much this had wrecked me, but she did not back off, she just kept showing up. Over the next few weeks we started seeing each other regularly, dinners at around 7 in the evening, long walks where we talked about everything except my failure, and slowly she started pulling me back into the world without ever making it feel like a forced recovery plan. The midpoint for me came one night when we were sitting in her living room at around 8:30, and she asked me what I actually wanted to do next, not what I thought I deserved or what would be easiest, but what I genuinely wanted, and I realized I had been avoiding that question entirely because wanting something again meant risking another failure. I told her that, and she said something that stuck with me. She said avoiding risk does not protect your worth, it just hides it until you forget it exists. That was the moment I stopped just reacting to my life and started making deliberate choices again, small at first, like setting a study schedule, reaching back out to Marcus, cutting down on the Tsar because I could feel how it was numbing more than just the pain. There were setbacks, days where the old thoughts came back hard and fast, telling me I was wasting time trying again, but Leela never treated those moments like proof that I was broken. She treated them like part of the process, and that consistency started to rewire how I saw myself. One night at around 11, I caught myself laughing at something stupid Marcus said over the phone, and it hit me that I had not genuinely laughed in months, and that realization felt bigger than passing any exam. Eventually, I registered to retake the test, not because I was trying to erase the past, but because I wanted to move forward regardless of it, and when I told Leela, she just smiled and said, "That sounds like you again." The day of the exam I was still nervous, still aware of what failure had felt like, but it no longer defined the entire outcome in my head, it was just one possibility among others. When I walked out of that testing center at around 2 in the afternoon, I did not know if I had passed, but for the first time it did not feel like my entire identity hinged on the result. Weeks later, when I got the email confirming I had passed, I felt relief and pride, but what surprised me was that it did not feel like I had been restored from nothing. It felt like I had been building something new all along. That night, I met Leela at the same cafe where we had our first real conversation, and I told her the news, and she hugged me in this simple, grounded way that made it clear she had never seen me as the failure I thought I was. Looking back now, I can see how close I came to letting one moment erase everything, how easy it would have been to disappear into that void and stay there. And what pulled me out was not some dramatic breakthrough or sudden burst of confidence. It was one person refusing to accept my worst interpretation of myself and giving me enough steady presence to start questioning it on my own. I still have bad days, still catch myself slipping into that old mindset sometimes, but now there is a counterweight, this memory of being seen differently, and the quiet realization that maybe my worth was never as fragile as I believed. Maybe it just needed someone to hold it steady long enough for me to see it again. A lot of pain in this world begins when good people start believing they are too damaged, too late, or too empty to be worth the effort. These stories remind us that the deepest changes often begin quietly, with one honest question, one brave boundary, one person who refuses to let another person disappear into despair. Some of these writers were running from heartbreak, some were hiding inside routine, some were so tired they could barely feel their own lives anymore. But again and again, the same truth kept returning. Your life does not become worthless because you are exhausted. Your future does not vanish because you got hurt. And your heart is not a burden just because it has been disappointed before. Real peace comes when you stop handing your worth over to fear, numbness, or people who cannot see you clearly. So tonight, let these stories settle gently. Let them remind you that caring is not weakness, boundaries are not cruelty, and walking away from what harms you is often the first kind thing you do for yourself. Rest easy now. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. Just remember that you deserve steadiness, honesty, and love that does not ask you to shrink. Take care of yourselves, establish those boundaries early, and sweet dreams, everyone.